When I was younger, the kids around the playground used to say that Old Man Harold killed his wife and fed her to his dog. I mean, my brother Jonesy and I never believed the stories, but that's not to say we weren't scared to death of walking past his house after school. We took extra caution because Harold was our neighbor, definitely not the type of neighbor to borrow milk from or invite over for a barbecue. My mom said Harold was to be left alone and that the stories I heard at school weren't true, and that was that. But there was one Saturday evening, one evening that I would never forget, when my brother and I regrettably spoke to the man. Sure, we had talked with him before, his wife too, but that was before she had passed away. Jonesy hadn't yet had his growth spurt, as my dad used to say, and so when I chucked my little brother our green frisbee, not even his biggest leap could stop it from going right over his head and into Harold's yard. Jonesy was so terrified of going over to fetch it that he wouldn't even play me at rock, paper, scissors to decide who was going to retrieve it. We were going to go together, he said. End of story. Thinking to myself about the schoolyard stories, I reluctantly agreed. We could hardly see anything that frigid winter evening, but my brother knew to follow the white of my sneakers as we made our way to the neighbor's lawn. The fence out front was shorter, chest height for me, and probably waist height for an adult. I managed to slide over the top, but had to help Jonesy over. Our neon frisbee stood out vividly against Harold's grass. I walked over and reached to grab it, but when I looked up, Harold had emerged from his screen door. So stood his dog, a vicious breed I couldn't name at my age, back when I only knew Labrador and Husky. Bits of slime hung loosely from its lips. The dog opened its mouth, but no bark ever came, only the noise of a screaming yelp, one that sounded like a woman's voice, nothing like a dog's cry. The man stood as a mere silhouette in the moonlight, the soft gleam of silver sparkling off his tall, sharp trowel. "She doesn't bite unless I make her," he said nonchalantly. Pale, unblinking globes were staring back at me and my brother. "I thought your dog was a boy," my brother started. I swiped the frisbee and the canine launched like I had just nabbed his chew toy. Flailing backwards, I toppled over the front fence. My brother soon followed. The dog whined again. It clamped planks of wood between its jaws as it struck the fence, growling at us as we ran away. Back at home, my brother and I never said a word to Mom or Dad. They had warned us about the old man next door, and we had ignored them. If we told them what had happened, it could only make things worse. It's been years since that night, and I'm in college. But now that I'm older, do I believe Harold murdered his wife? Probably not. Do I think that it was really his wife's voice crawling out of his pet dog? Definitely not. I think the mind plays scary tricks when you're young and afraid. However, did I think that he would hurt my brother and I if our frisbee went over his fence again? That's a different story. Mrs. Ford is an old widow, probably somewhere in her 70s, though I find that the older a person is, the harder it is to tell their age. She has been me and my roommate's next-door neighbor since we moved in during sophomore year, and as far as we could tell, she's been living in the same two-bedroom apartment for multiple decades. We share one wall with Mrs. Ford. Thankfully, it's one of the living room walls, so none of us ever had to worry the old lady would hear anything inappropriate, like we would if we shared a wall to one of the bedrooms. When we first moved in, complete with our scarce secondhand furniture and my cat Miller, I thought it was weird that the previous tenants had left a few items in the place. A dresser in one of the bedrooms, some kitchen utensils, and notably, a huge mirror hanging on the living room wall. But since my roommates and I were barely adults, and thus didn't have many possessions to our name, we kind of appreciated that. The day we moved in, Mrs. Ford had brought us a freshly baked apple pie as a housewarming gesture, and told us about the apartment building's glory days. A week after we'd moved in, one of my roommate's parents got into a car accident and needed her at the hospital. She broke the news to us, packed an overnight bag, and left. The next day, there was Mrs. Ford at our door with a casserole she had made. She said she had had a terrible dream about someone getting hurt, and she had just wanted to come by and make sure everyone was okay. I thought it was kind of a weird coincidence that she'd had a dream like that the same night as my roommate's parents' car accident. But in the end, I thought maybe she'd overheard us talking and subconsciously dreamed about it. But then, there was Mrs. Ford at our doorstep again, holding a six-pack of beer and smiling, the same morning we decided to throw a small party in our apartment for our college friends. We hadn't even told anybody yet. I started to have the eerie feeling that maybe the old woman was listening in on our conversations. So my roommates and I devised a plan. We started saying random, false things out loud in the living room and writing the real messages on a whiteboard we hung on the opposite wall as the mirror. When we said, "I'm doing laundry today," we wrote "laundry tomorrow" on the whiteboard. When I said, "It's my birthday in 1 week," I wrote "my birthday's in 3 days." Sure, it was small things, and it wouldn't have been the end of the world if the old woman was listening in. But it was the principle of the thing. We had a right to privacy, and we wanted to know if we were being robbed of it. But here's the thing. Mrs. Ford always knew the truth. As though by magic, there she was folding our laundry in the building's communal laundry room. And there she was too, holding a shakily frosted cake at our doorstep on my birthday. So as unlikely as it felt, we learned to accept that Mrs. Ford just knew things, that she might be some sort of psychic or seer or something funky like that. Until one night, when I was watching an old comedy with my roommates and eating copious amounts of popcorn. It was that movie The Parent Trap, with young Lindsay Lohan playing the twins. We were at the part when the evil, soon-to-be stepmom goes hiking with the family, and the twins manage to get her to put a lizard in her mouth. We all giggled. But when we fell quiet again, our hairs stood on end. We could hear the sound of giggling coming from the other side of the wall we shared with Mrs. Ford. We glanced at each other, trying not to show outwardly that we'd heard it. Did we have an intruder? Were we in danger? I waited a minute, then stood up slowly and walked to the opposite wall, where the mirror hung over the table by the front door, where my phone had been charging. I wanted to have my phone near me, in case we needed to call 911. In the movie, the evil stepmom woke up with her mattress floating on a lake. My roommates laughed nervously, trying to give the impression that nothing was wrong. There it was again, the giggling from the other side of the wall. But this time, I heard where it came from. It came from the mirror. I grabbed the edges of the mirror and lifted it off the wall. Behind it, on the white painted concrete, I saw a small hole the size of a bottle cap, and through the hole, my neighbor's apartment. She must have seen me take the mirror down and move out of the way so I couldn't see her. As I looked at the mirror, I realized that it was a two-way mirror, and she had been watching us the entire time. For the first 3 years that I lived next door to the Whelans, I never had any problems. The problems only started when their son Matthew came home from university. For the entire time that I had lived next door, Matthew had been away in another city. He didn't visit during holidays, except for one Christmas when I happened to be away. In the brief conversations I had with Mr. and Mrs. Whelan, they had never mentioned him, and so I was actually surprised to find out that he even existed. At first, when my mom mentioned that she had spotted him carrying stuff into the house, I was intrigued. Matthew would have been a similar age to me, and since there were not many folks of my age in the area where I lived, I actually thought at first that if we met, we might get along. I even considered inviting him out with myself and my friends, in case he found it hard coming back to town. In retrospect, though, I'm kinda glad that I didn't. For the first week after he moved in, I didn't see Matthew. I continued to wave to Mr. Whelan when I passed him in the mornings, and even to Mrs. Whelan when she peeked out from behind the net curtain. When I first saw Matthew, he was on the roof. I was heading back from a night out, stumbling, slightly drunk, up the path to our front door and attempting to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake my parents. I was looking in my purse for the key when I heard an odd whistling sound coming from somewhere above me. The sound was not a real whistle, as a normal person might make to get someone's attention, or to carry a tune, but rather a hissing sound. Stepping back up the path to investigate, I glanced upward and almost jumped out of my skin when I saw, perched on the roof of my neighbor's house, the figure of a young man. He was wearing only his underwear and was staring directly at me. He didn't speak, but instead again hissed through his teeth at me. I glared back, wondering exactly what he found to do on the roof in his underwear at 3 a.m., and then decided that the only polite thing to do, assuming this was Matthew, would be to wave. I raised my hand sheepishly to indicate that I had noticed him, and in essence, to say hello. He did not say anything in response, but instead simply continued to stare. Then, slowly and very deliberately, he stuck out his tongue to its fullest extent and licked his lips. Then, in an equally deliberate fashion, he pointed with 2 fingers to his own eyes, then with 1 finger at me, as if to say, "I'm watching you." As a young female, alone in the dark at 3 a.m., I'll admit I was a little unnerved by this, even if I was right outside my doorstep. The following morning, I was about to tell my mother about this incident when she preempted my words by announcing that a letter had arrived for me that morning. Looking at the envelope she passed me, I noticed immediately that there was no stamp. This letter had been hand-delivered. Inside were photographs, Polaroid photos of me from several days earlier, before I had seen or even spoken to Matthew. This already was too much. Marching over to the Whelans' place, I asked to speak to Matthew, but was told by Mrs. Whelan that he was out. She did say that she would let him know that I called. Not wanting to upset her, I did not break into my planned tirade about personal space and privacy, or tell her that her son had been taking photos of me without consent, but instead simply told her that I would come back the following day. As it happened, Matthew called on me first. I was laying in bed around 2 a.m. and had been asleep for almost an hour when I was woken by a strange sound coming from above me. I lay still, staring at the ceiling and trying to work out what the sound could be, when, after a small pitter-patter of movement, it occurred to me that the sound was footsteps on our roof. Getting up from bed, I moved slowly over to the window and, hanging half out, tried to see if I could make out a figure moving around up there. I couldn't, but as soon as I pulled my head back inside, I again heard that same animalistic hissing. Despite the sweltering heat, I closed my bedroom window and locked it. The following day, I again called the Whelans. Again, I was told that Matthew was out. Later that day, I received another bundle of photographs through the door, this time of me sleeping. That night, I didn't go to bed, but instead sat on a deck chair in my front garden, waiting for Matthew. Clearly, he had already arrived, because around 1 a.m., he emerged from his bedroom window and climbed onto the roof of his parents' house. I asked him who the hell he thought he was, reminding him that he had no right photographing me without my consent, and that our roof was private property, not somewhere he could just decide to walk around in the middle of the night. Squatting, he looked down at me and grinned, before again making that hissing noise. "Cats walk around on the roofs every night. You don't tell them it's private property," he said with a smirk. "You're not a cat," I replied flatly. "Oh, but I am," he whispered, "and you are a mouse. Squeak, squeak, squeak." Rising from my chair, I entered the house and again locked the door firmly. The following day, I lodged a complaint with the police, and a few days later, Matthew moved out. I'm not sure where he moved to, or if he ever plans to come back.